In Fiji, you can't blame the lawyers. They were us. Australian lawyers, all the lawyers. So you can't blame the legal nostrums. You can blame them because they didn't work, but clearly it's not because they were lousy nostrums of that sort, it's just they were the nostrums that did not fit the disease that many billions of dollars are being spent to cure, that is, widespread prevalence of arbitrariness of power. What is the thing which holds these three, in my view, inadequate understandings of the rule of law together? It is serene confidence, and lawyers' confidence about law is often serene, a serene confidence that the heart of the rule of law, of course, must be in legal institutions, and that we know what those legal institutions should be, should do, should look like. So the World Bank has had, until it's a bit chastened, checklists of the sorts of things which a rule of law program should do if you introduce it into Azerbaijan, into Warsaw, into Kabul. Of course, this is a fast lecture. A bit of caricature should be allowed, but I think that the bottom line is true. Now, the truth. I want to suggest that these legally focused conceptions of the rule of law, what I call anatomical conceptions of the rule of law, answer the question, what's the rule of law, by saying, well, it's this feature or that feature or some other feature of legal institutions. I think that is a very mistaken place to start, however clever you were about the features. I think the place to start has to be an earlier question, not chronologically earlier, but logically earlier. What are we after? Why is anybody interested in the rule of law? Why not go fishing? What's special about the rule of law? Well, we have a lot of literature on this, from political theory, from Aristotle, who said it's better to be ruled by laws than by any man. Why is he saying that? We don't look to Aristotle and say, well, what particularly legal institutions did Aristotle have? Perhaps they'll work in Afghanistan. We don't do that. But we do think of Aristotle because he says there's something at stake here. And what is at stake is that arbitrary power is lousy. And it would be terrific if we could routinely institutionalize checks on the possibility of arbitrary power. Why? Because it is very frightening to be the victim of arbitrary power. And why again? Because it is very confusing. You don't know what's going to happen. You can't organize your actions. There are plenty of reasons. I don't want here to develop the specific answer that I have gestured at, and it's not adequate anyway, to the first question, the teleological question, what's the point? I just want to say that's the place to start. And I want to say too, and this is philosophically ambitious, not philosophically, it's just philosophically ambitious, but I don't have many arguments for it. That is, that I want to say that the answer to that question is a pretty general answer. That is, I don't know anywhere where it's nice to be abused by arbitrary power. So it's not just that I dislike arbitrary power, and the bongo bongo like it. I think the bongo bongo probably would do better not to have arbitrary power visited on them as well. So I think this first question deserves some general, it'd be more ambitious to say universalizable answer. At least as an entry point, the rule of law is about restraint on the possibility of arbitrary power. It can be more than that. In countries like ours, where that has been secured, compared to most countries in the world, we can aim for greater, more morally deep and rich, textured understandings and elements of the rule of law. But as a starting point, this seems to me the bottom line. And if you start there, then I think there's a second question you can ask, which is still leads to fairly general answers, but not universal answers. Well, if you think it's important to somehow institutionalize restraint on power, what would your institutions have to be able to do? Or what would they have to be like to be able to do that? We're not yet nominating a particular institution as Dicey does, or the particular character of laws as the philosophers do, or a particular checklist as the rule of law specialists. You're just saying, look, if restraint on power is important, what do you want your institutions, whatever they are, to do? Well, first of all, they've got to be able to reach the powerful. Latin America is full of commercial areas of law which are quite nifty, because that's important to people with power. But there are a lot of other areas of life where the law doesn't reach, because it's against the interests of power holders for it to reach there. So the first intuitive recommendation I make is, well, the institutions have to be able to reach the people they have to restrain. It doesn't sound like rocket science. Secondly, what sort of character should these laws have? And here we get into the philosopher's terrain. Well, and it's an important terrain, but it's only part of the story. Well, the laws have to be somehow able to be worked out. Now, how that is done may be very different in different societies with different patterns of understanding, with different traditions, different sets of powerful people, different hidden structures and not so hidden structures. Thirdly, and these first three are pretty standard in the literature, but not as an answer to this question. Third is the administration of the law has to be, in some coherent way, related to what the law says. Otherwise, obviously, it's fantasy land. It's a masquerade. But fourthly, and this is what jurisprudence doesn't talk about, except in a perfunctory way of saying, well, the law has to be effective. The laws have to count as a restraint on power. They have to count in the normative economy in people's heads. People have to think, we can't do this, much as we might like to do that. I used to give the example of the Whitlam sacking, which was roughly coterminous with the transformation of the attempt by the Russians to change the ruler of Afghanistan. If you remember the Whitlam sacking, I'm sure you do. I'll pass up, for reasons of time, the attempt I always make to imitate the various voices in this thing, but later, at a private interview. But sure, 4 years after that, there was a lot of killing in Afghanistan, not for the first time, and the Soviets decided, with the then Prime Minister of Afghanistan, that they would have to get rid of the Foreign Minister, who they offered, or they were preparing to offer, an ambassadorship, I think, to East Germany. He got wind of this offer, came to the meeting, shot dead his Prime Minister, took over as Prime Minister, and I think it was 20,000 people were killed in the next few years. These are two different strategies for dealing with disappointment. And for all I know, the law that governed the occasion was the same. I doubt if that's true, but it could have been, for all it mattered. So the law has to count, and it is a deep sociological range of questions what you even mean by saying the law counts. Part of it is this gross one. Do people obey the law? But another part is, does the law enter into people's heads when they are trying to decide what to do? A Bulgarian saying, which I use yet another opportunity to... There is a Bulgarian saying that the law is like a door erected in the middle of an open meadow. Of course, you could go through the door, but only an idiot would bother doing that. Now, there are many countries in the world where the law is understood as a door, and maybe even a door to a dangerous place, which is another wrinkle on that. Somewhere you don't go unless you're forced to go. It's a very different thing where the rights of people among themselves, if your car is in the front and is hit by somebody in the back, suddenly your attitude is very different. Much more boisterous, at least in my own experience, than if you were in the back and you had to go in the front. Why? Because it enters the moral economy, or the normative economy, in your head. In a famous essay with people of a certain vintage, that is at least my age, will remember as causing a stir in legal circles, the yet Marxist but about to be ostracised historian E.P. Thompson wrote a glorious 11 pages at the end of his book Whigs and Hunters, which was a paean to the rule of law. He said the institutionalisation of restraint on arbitrary power is an unqualified human good. And when you look at him, fortunately he wasn't a lawyer. He didn't say, well, our judges don't have discretions and all the law comes from the courts. He said, it's in people's heads. When peasants get their land holdings interfered with, they're angry because their rights have been infringed. A friend of mine and a former colleague at this law school, now a distinguished senior counsel in Melbourne, David Neal, published a book called The Rule of Law in a Penal Colony, much influenced, he was then, by Thompson's ideas. And his question was, how did a penal colony, as it was set up in the late 18th century, become a free society some 40 years later? And he said, well, the unintended baggage which was carried by the convicts, was this notion that they were subjects, but not just subjects, but with rights. And they insisted on their rights. They had to do it. I've often had the fantasy, what if Russia had landed in Sydney Cove? What if then the view of what rights people had and what should happen. Neil starts his book, I'm getting carried away, I might be carried away, but I'm near to the end, I think. He starts his book with this extraordinary exemplary tale of Henry Kendall, I think, Cable, who meets Mary, falls in love in Norwich jail. They have a child. They are on the first boat to Australia, but the child is not to go with them. And they're very distressed, and a turnkey gallops to see Lord Sydney, who's in charge of this operation, pleads with him for the child to be allowed. Child is allowed. In Britain, the press is onto this, and a collection is made for these people, £20, and they buy things for the child. They send it with a accompanying cargo boat. They come to Sydney. The captain of the cargo boat says, "Oh, sorry, it's gone. Don't have it." The first civil case in New South Wales is Cable suing and succeeding against this captain, a rather important person in a penal colony. That's an extraordinary story. It's not a Russian story. It's not even I go a lot to Eastern Europe. I've seen nowhere where that seems even a plausible story. So, the law has to count. This leads me to my fifth and penultimate claim, that to think seriously about the rule of law, we have to think, of course we have to think seriously about law, but we have to think just as seriously, and nobody does, about the social behaviour, context and interactions of law with people in the society. For the institutions of central law to make any difference, they have to work in sync with a whole range of other, what some so-called legal pluralists call semi-autonomous social groups, in which most of us live most of our times. They're also sending messages. Law is sending messages, but the groups we live in, the organisations we work in, the mafias which may run us, they're also sending messages. If these things are not in sync, then it is a matter of social variation which ones are going to win. And if you're in a society where typically the law has not won, or is won in a way that nobody wants to rely on it, they simply try to duck it, then you're in a society which is radically different from what I take to be an exemplary rule of law society. And so the social science that doesn't exist, that I think should exist, is one which takes very seriously, on the one hand, the normative claim which is echoed through generations of political and theory and political philosophy and legal philosophy, that the rule of law is not just a cliche that lawyers should roll out on occasions, or that should become a kind of rhetorical fig leaf for whatever rubbish is happening in a particular society at a particular time. That the stakes of the rule of law are enormously high. And that if, as is now being attempted in so many societies, in so many parts of the world, there's an attempt to generate the rule of law, then the obsession we have had traditionally with traditional legal recipes, often very local, parochial legal recipes. If it worked in the commercial code worked in Atlanta, Georgia, perhaps it'll work in Tbilisi, Georgia, but perhaps it won't. And it won't be because the terms are differently drawn. There's more to be said about that, about all of these things, and I won't say it. Or instead, I'll conclude with my small embarrassment, which actually may be theoretically a large embarrassment, but I'm trying to cope. And that is that if you look at the rule of law rich countries, they didn't do it my way. That is, if you look at Britain, which is an exemplary rule of law country compared to virtually anywhere else, many Western European countries also have long traditions. What they have is long traditions, where nobody came with a blueprint for designing or a deep theorized understanding of the social and cultural and other contexts of the law. These things developed, sometimes willy-nilly, sometimes with rather inspired tinkering. And I think of the American Constitution as a piece of inspired tinkering within a very long and rich tradition. But the rule of law project of so many people, relevant to us in our region, in the Pacific, in East Timor, relevant to the wider world in many other parts, in the Middle East, in Africa, that project doesn't have those traditions. So am I trying to suggest a recipe for failure? Well, I think it might fail, whatever I've suggested. But I don't think it's a recipe for failure. I think that for both moral and intellectual reasons, the rule of law project is a defensible one. I'd be happy to try to defend it. But I think that this apparent exception and embarrassment actually, of course I think this, proves my point, which is that the mystery of why the rule of law works in some societies and not in others is not a technical legal mystery. It is a sociological or political logical. It is a mystery of connection, of ramification of legal institutions within societies, which, and this is another part of it, since societies differ, since power structures differ so much between societies, even if you could come up with recipes, they would have to differ to take account of these different characteristics. We don't know enough about those differences, and the stakes, as I've been saying, are very high, and so I end with a plea for nothing much except the social science that doesn't exist. Now that's, I think, a very vague way to end, unlike the sort of crisp Dycean 3 points, which incidentally my favourite political theorist, Judith Shklar, called an unfortunate outburst of Anglo-Saxon parochialism, which manages at the same time, this is the most influential for a very long time definition of the rule of law, which manages at the same time to trivialise the rule of law by associating it with only one and only one country and history, and to formalise it by associating it with just one particular group of institutions. Now it seems to me that that's a bankrupt enterprise, and that the enterprise where I can't show any results, sadly, I can only plead for it, that I recommend is in its infancy, but that baby should be nurtured. Now that's a much vaguer, as I say, way to end a talk than Dicey could have ended his. And I only seek consolation from two sources, and with that I'll finish. The first, I was in New Zealand last year, and I was in the office of a colleague there, and he had pasted on his door a passage from the American philosopher Richard Rorty, according to which it's the vague people who are the pioneers. And I reckon that by that judgment I'm up there with Columbus, and proud to be so. But more to the point, and on the point, in a passage which is not completely easy to start, but ends in a comprehensible way, a passage from the remarkable, also Nobel Prize-winning economist, philosopher Amartya Sen, a speech which should have been more influential in the World Bank than it has been, but at least has had some resonance. He says the following: even when we consider development in a particular sphere, such as economic development or legal development, the instruments that are needed to enhance development in that circumscribed sphere may not be confined only to institutions and policies in that sphere. You got that? Well, it gets better. If this sounds a little complex, I must point out that the complication relates ultimately to the interdependences of the world in which we live. I, he, but I can say I too, did not create that world, and any blame for it has to be addressed elsewhere. Thanks very much.